So I'm just going to briefly introduce myself. I'm Adriana Jacobs, and I'm a translator from Hebrew to English. I also teach Hebrew literature at the University of Oxford. But today I'm mostly wearing my hat as the translator of this book. This is Vaan Nguyen's poetry collection, Ayelet Tsabari, which is translated into English as the Truffle Eye. And it came out in February through Zephyr Press, which is a US-based independent publisher that focuses on poetry and translation. Hand it over to you and Ayelet and Vaan, if you want to say a few words about yourself.
So hi everyone, my name is Ayelet. I'm a native Hebrew speaker, but I write in English mostly. I've written 2 books in English, The Best Place on Earth and The Art of Leaving. I also do some translation, mostly from Hebrew to English. And I teach creative writing in a few different places.
Hi, I'm Vaan. Adriana translated my book. I write in Hebrew, and most of the day I'm reading and writing, and that's it.
Sounds like a good life.
Yeah, that sounds like bliss. So today's conversation, we hope, will just sort of flow more or less organically, although there are some things that we're eager to talk about. So actually going to kick off with a question and some reflections on English. And I want to start quoting from Ayelet's memoir, The Art of Leaving, where she writes, "English was a place I fled to, an act of reinvention that echoed the anonymity and freedom I had felt when migrating to a new country, eliciting the same exhilarating thrill of stepping outside of my comfort zone." So I ask Ayelet a question about this. I just say a little bit about why this sentence stood out for me. I really identified with it. Because one of the things that drew me to Hebrew in my early 20s, which is when I started studying the language, was the desire to step my comfort zone. Until then, my primary languages were English and Spanish, which were languages I grew up speaking and writing and reading and researching. And suddenly Hebrew gave me the chance to not necessarily be someone else, but to experience myself in a different language, which I think always reveals something that's already there, but that maybe sometimes isn't entirely expressed, or that one doesn't have the words for in another language. And that was really exciting. And I started that adventure and never really have ended it. I'm still on it in some ways. But then when people ask me about translating into English, I always find that the assumption is that somehow I'm translating into a language over which I have greater mastery and over which I'm more confident and more familiar. But I actually think the opposite happens. I think that carry over all the discomfort and feel of being unsettled in Hebrew into my English, and then English turns into a language that feels very strange and unfamiliar. And so at that point, I'm not even sure I have a language anymore that I could say that I feel entirely at home in. And I rather like being in that state of mind most of the time. And so I thought, Ayelet, if you could revisit that sentence from The Art of Leaving and how you feel about it maybe now that you are back in Israel using Hebrew in your everyday life.
Yeah, and I'm going to launch now into an hour-long answer because I have so much to say. No, I won't, I promise. But it's so interesting, like the thing you said at the end, actually, about how you don't feel like you have mastery over English and how you kind of feel not at home in either language. I feel that way now. And I mean, I'm feeling better in Hebrew now because I've been living here for 3 years now. Even though it's my mother tongue. In your case, English was not really your mother tongue, right? Because you grew up speaking Spanish and only then acquired English. But for me, Hebrew was my only tongue for a very long time. English was not even, I wasn't particularly good at English. I was just average Israeli, who speaks English kind of. My matriculation exam, my bagrut in English was the lowest mark I had, out of all of them. I was just, it was just okay. But okay, so what I was going to skip later to what happens after you start writing in another language and you become so immersed in it and you live in it. Hebrew started to feel a bit foreign to me, even though English still wasn't, I still didn't feel like I mastered it. So the first time I was asked to write in Hebrew, actually it was for Granta, for, an issue of them. And I really struggled. And I wrote certain things not quite right. And I used English syntax and it felt like a challenge. And I'm like, great, what have I done? I basically sentenced myself to a life of disquiet and discomfort in both languages. Like you said, it's like I'm never quite at home in either of them. You see, I can't even figure out the prepositions. So I can really relate to that feeling. And for me, yes, it mirrors the feeling that I've had being an immigrant and leaving. So back to it being a comfort zone. I think, I spent an entire book, I think, kind of trying to understand the reasons that made me leave Israel at the time. And the experience of leaving Israel and leaving Hebrew was entwined for me. In both cases, it was both an escape, a running away, but also something comforting. The anonymity was comforting. Even though English is one of the most spoken languages in the world, for me, I felt anonymous in it, and I felt like I could do anything. And there was such freedom in that. I could be anything. I could be a new writer. I could be a new person, I could write whatever I want. It really helps when your mother can't read what you write. I really recommend that. So it felt to me like I could do more, even though I could do less, because the language, the tools I had were limited and the skills I had were limited. And in that sense, it also mirrors the idea of constraint in writing and in literature, and how sometimes within the constraints we can find such creativity and such freedom. So actually being forced and reduced to a language that my vocabulary wasn't, great at the time, and my grammar skills were not great, all of that was actually, to me, amazing. It was liberating, and it felt wonderful. So yeah, that's just al qta mazleg, on the edge of a fork. Yeah.
Vaan, what's it like for you to see your work in English, and I guess you could say in my English, especially since we've had, I think the translation of the Truffle Eye has taken many years since the first time I wrote to you and said that I was interested in translating and publishing the translations. Finally, the book coming out, it's been actually several years. Now there's a whole book of your work in English translation. Yeah, thank you. I'm glad I finally managed to it too. But yeah, I've always been, I can't believe I haven't asked you before the question of what it's like to read your work in another language.
Well, it's liberating, because I feel connected to the world, because people are reading it in English and writing me mails and send me classic mails with a paper and a stamp. So so I get in contact with a lot of people from around the world, and it's interesting to see how they feel about my poetry. And so I like the nituchim, how do you say it?
The way
analysis.
Their analysis. I like to read it because I'm learning a lot from it.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I know, Adriana, I know that you translate, other people's work, but have you ever been translated as well? Your own writing?
Yeah, a little bit. So I've had some of my academic writing translated into Hebrew. I did write one thing on my own, and that was really interesting because you were saying about how you felt like English since crept into your Hebrew. I mean, I could see this right away with when I was trying to write in Hebrew. And I was actually okay with it. I think because Hebrew is not the language I grew up with and I did rather late, I've always been really open to making mistakes in it or just letting things infiltrate it. I don't feel any sort of sense of responsibility to follow rules of grammar. And I never actually taught Hebrew as a language, so I'm absolutely not, I mean, I studied it, but in terms of teaching other people how to speak or write in Hebrew, that's not something I've done. So that may also be a part of this as well, not as attached to those rules. But I also don't think I'm attached to those rules in English either. So it's pretty consistent across the languages I used. I found it incredibly disorienting when I read myself translate by someone else into Hebrew. And I actually couldn't read it for a long time. I had to put it aside because the moment I started reading it, I was like, that's me. That's not who I am. That's not how I sound. And it was just so strange, but I also couldn't see the English anymore. I couldn't even read into it the English which is great, but it was very bizarre. Of course, finally I do it, and it was fascinating. I think for the Vaan was saying really struck me was the chance to see how someone else is sort of interpreting what you're saying. And I loved that aspect of it. It's like it just felt really intimate to get this other perspective on some argument. It was an academic piece, but so, and I think that as a translator also, though, I've been really moved by the way people read the translations of Vaan's poems and the different things they're seeing in there. Because I don't think that translating has made me necessarily some sort of expert on her work. I think actually the translating was a way of me also trying to make some of the poems for myself. But I don't necessarily have my, a coherent or final reading of things. So then hearing the readers have reacted to Vaan's poetry and translation has been so fascinating. I want to go back and redo things because I love the way that looking at it and the conclusions they're drawing.
Yeah, there's something so humbling. There's such humility about the act of translation, I find. It's like you kind of have to get out of the way, it feels, and when you're also a writer and a translator, it's such a different, it feels like on one hand, of course, they're both creative and so on, and words, but still it feels very like a very different part of my brain. I want to ask about how it felt to be translated as well. I want to answer that, but I also want to ask one more thing of the two of you, because I find, every time I translate, I usually translate poetry, basically because I find it too long to translate prose, and I don't have time. I need to write my own prose. But the relationship, you said intimate, how intimate it is, how someone else sees your work. And it's different with every poet, I find. And I just wondered if for you two, it was kind of a dialogue, or how was the process of it? Maybe you can talk about that a little bit. Both of you.
In general, Adriana did her own thing, but we met a couple of times. And I wanted to say about translation, about her translation, that usually in a dry translation, you're just comparing the two verses, and you see one-on-one the differences. But she made it she gave it. she didn't did a dry translation. She gave it more space for interpretation, and she gave it like more. She uses like how do you say it? Like memories and her own inner world to it. And she did a really great job sending out my my feelings, my inner world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, I really, I'm glad to hear that, Vaan, because it means a lot that you say that, but also because it's like you're putting your finger on how I really think that one of the things I love about poetry translation, I don't do much prose, so it's possible that what I'm saying completely applies to prose as well, is that I really don't have a sense of ownership over the translating of Vaan's poetry. I actually think, I love it when other people offer up their own translations. I think every single translation reflects more sort of how an individual translator is reading and absorbing and projecting a piece writing. And so I don't feel any sort of possessiveness on that. But I definitely feel like when I read the translations, I see them as I can see where it's my language as well, where it's like also putting something of myself into it, because such a personal process of translating someone else's writing into your language. And I mean, in terms of like your personal language, not language as some sort of national sort of space or something, or construct. But yeah, the process of translating with Vaan was actually really quite relaxed. I think she gave so much space to come to my own conclusions. And there were times, especially to the very end, when she would say, well, actually, this is what I had in mind, but I like what you did. So then I felt like, okay, good. I'm not being told that. There were some things there were some fun mistakes I made, partly because I just didn't quite understand an idiom or something. And so it was kind of also fun to see how to make the mistakes work. Because they do, and I did. I asked you sometimes. There was one like poem that had a math concept, which I would have just never known because I was not even familiar with math concept in any language. And then I was reading articles about it and trying to figure. I think that those are moments also when you can, when I say make the mistakes work, that you create a moment where readers can really have fun with the text and they can play with it and they can come up with their own read of it. So I do try to avoid kind of making decisions, close the reading of the poem and try as much as possible to keep it open, because that's the way I'm experiencing the Hebrew. Which then brings me, I think, to the thing I wanted to ask you about your relationship to the translations of your work, because I know I think it was with first book, you didn't translate it.
No, I did.
So, and I imagine that there's going to be a very different tug of war between the languages.
Yeah, that's exactly like where I was where I was going to go, because when like obviously there's different. I experienced different translations differently, like translations into languages I don't understand and can't read. I'm always very pleased, that of course that the books are being translated into a different language, but there's a lack of control that can be a little bit scary, a little bit frustrating at times. I really want to know, and I've heard it, read aloud in Italian in a book launch that I was in Italy, and it sounded beautiful, but I'm trying to read the people's faces, and I'm trying to catch like, oh, this is the passage, I can recognize something. And but with Hebrew, of course, it's different, and I always imagined that I would translate my own book. I did have a little bit of a guilt, an irrational guilt about writing in English when I started out. I don't know. I don't know if, like I said, it was irrational, but I felt like there was something about, you know, like an abandoning my mother tongue, falling in love with someone else. There was that kind of feeling about that. And when I heard that the book was going to, no, before I heard the book was going to be published in Hebrew, I was thinking to myself, I'll just translate it myself, and then I can kind of, you know, feel better about it, you know, because I rewrote it in Hebrew, and I had this fantasy of how I will, you know, sublet an apartment by the beach and translate all day. And then I had a baby, and I was like, no, this is not going to happen. I don't have time. I need to write I'm already into my second book. I don't have time to rewrite my book in you know, a second time, because this is what it's going to be like. And I did have some insecurity. You know, I feel better about Hebrew now because, like I said, I'm living here now. But before, I was feeling a little bit insecure that I won't be able to pull it off. I won't be able to translate my own work well enough. Anyway, I decided not to. And I had a wonderful translator. I had Boya Ben Baruch. She translated it for Amoved. And of course, when I first got, you know, like you said, you had to let it sit for a bit. I was really nervous. She sent me a kind of similarly to poetry, I guess. She sent me a story at a time, so it wasn't as daunting. It was the first book, and I liked the translation, but I immediately needed to change it, and that's what I did. You know, like it was very much a dialogue. She was wonderful. She totally accepted that I would, you know, change sentences, pull out sentences, insert new sentences, change words. Like during that time, most of the time I was actually in Israel, which was good because it helped my Hebrew was alive. I also kept a piece of paper. I read strictly in Hebrew during that time. Usually I read mostly in English, and now even more so because I'm scared for my English because I'm living more in Hebrew. But I read strictly in Hebrew to keep it alive. I pulled words from the text that I read, and I was like, oh, I love that word. It's going on the page. And I had a piece of paper with words that I loved, and I found places to insert them into my stories. But yeah, she really worked with me, and we also had an editor, and sometimes the editor would say, I think Bruria's sentence works better here because your sentence isn't, you know, in an English syntax or whatever. But yeah, I caught some mistakes, you know, and sometimes it was just a matter of taste. But I feel like my fingerprints are all over that book. And that's why when people ask me now, like I read English well, but what should I read? Should I read the English original or should I read the Hebrew translation? I always tell them, whatever you feel comfortable. If you feel comfortable reading in Hebrew, it feels mine, you know? And if it's usually like a book and its translations are like cousins, in this case they're like siblings, you know, they're really close, and I'm really proud of the Hebrew translation, and I'm really happy that I got to work with, you know, with someone that was accommodating and willing, you know, to work with me. Yeah, it was kind of it was fun. Yeah.
Yeah, the role of the editor, I think, is often a bit underplayed when we talk about literary translation. I think with the translation of the Translator, who's also the founding publisher of Zephyr Press, she spent so much time with the manuscript. I mean, she had some of these words, and she reads, and she would like nitpick the Hebrew also. Like she was constantly picking up like little mistakes. They were my fault because I had to actually transcribe the whole book.
She knew Hebrew?
Hebrew. She knows Hebrew. Yeah. So we were also really lucky because that's not something to take for granted. A lot of times when I'm publishing translations from Hebrew, the editors don't know Hebrew at all. So they're completely trusting that I've transcribed the Hebrew correctly, which isn't always the case. Nikud is fiddly and there's always so much room for error, especially when you're moving between word applications. And yeah, a lot of the time I don't have the benefit of an editor who can, yeah, what's that?
Also, the original Nikud in my book, in my Hebrew book, wasn't that good. There was a lot of mistakes.
Right. So the full eye, actually, I know I remember this when we're going through the final proofs, and Vaan sent a whole list. She's like, I caught all these mistakes in the Hebrew code, or I think this is wrong. Can you double check? So in some ways, I think that the Zephyr Press edition has this very it's a cleaner copy of the Hebrew. It was really funny, but I think I think that's interesting. Your experience of working with the Hebrew translation. And when you said, you would pull out this sentence or you wanted to do this, is that I think sometimes people read my translations of Vaan or other poets, and they'll say, well, if they know Hebrew, they'll say, oh, well, this isn't in the Hebrew, or in the Hebrew, it's a little different. Yeah. And they assume that it's because it must be because it's a problem with my understanding of Hebrew. But a lot of it has to do with a conversation with the author, because I mostly translate living poets, and that the authors themselves will say, oh, I kind of like, let's do this. Or if I propose a different way of translating the line and they're like, that sounds great, and they give me their blessing, then we go with it. But it means that then it's absolutely not going to be a mirrored relationship between the two languages. And that actually the translation offers up almost this kind of projection of a non-existent Hebrew version because it allows for those sort of differences. So in our case, the Hebrew translation offers up some sort of imaginary English version that grew out of that process, which I think is really exciting to multiply in those ways.
And that makes me think of that poem we talked about, because of that, that process of translating. Like when I was translating, I wasn't translating, when Julia was translating and I was working with her, I kept saying translating back. Like it's like it's coming home in a weird sense, even though the original was English, and we talked about this a little bit when we talked before about how sometimes even when I write English, but I write people who generally, mostly, not always, I do, but a lot of the times my characters actually speak Hebrew. So it's always like that. That brain is working dually. I'm writing the dialogue the way that it sounds best, but at the back of my mind, I'm thinking, how would that sound in Hebrew? That doesn't work. Well, I'll deal with that later if it ever gets translated. But there's this, there's this conversation in my head between the English and the Hebrew constantly, especially in dialogue. But it made me think also of that poem where you were translating, something that was originally, that Vaan actually translated from English into Hebrew, and then you translated back. And I was wondering, maybe it's such a short poem, maybe you want to read it and talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Vaan, do you have a copy of the book?
Yes, I have it. So I read in Hebrew and you in English?
Yeah.
Okay. מעיין. הם נפגשים בלב העיר, בוהמה עברית, לתכנן מעיין שופע בסנטרל של הפארק. איפה השלג של אתמול האשתקד, שאל וילון בתקופה שהמילים התעלו מעל הנאות הגוף, לפני שצמחו כל גרודי השחקים?
Mine.
I think I said Villon, but its name is Vion, right?
Oh, I was going to say something about that, but I love that it's Villon in the Hebrew. All right, so let me read my English translation. Maayan. They meet the heart of this Hebrew bohem to compose a flowing fountain in the Central Park. But where the snows of yesteryear, asked Villon, then when words transcended the body's pleasures before all the skyscrapers grew. So yeah, I'll just say that, as soon as I saw that it would, in Hebrew it says Sha'al Villon, and there was this line. And so, of course, the first thing next to my mind is that, first figure Villon, I figured quickly was Villon, Francois Villon, this French poet. And then finding the source of line in the French. But, so I think I initially translated it myself. But I actually really like when I graft someone else's translations or words in English into my English translations, because I love having that kind of multiplicity of voices. So I was like, well, it's someone certainly translated this poem into English, and many people have. It's a poem. I'm trying to find. Let's see. I have to consult my own note on it. In French, it's a long poem. Yeah, it's the Ballad of the Ladies of Times Gone By, 15th century poem where he kind of goes through various men, including Joan of Arc, who are sort of important in the French history up to that moment. And then, of course, this line is really famous. And so I decided to go with Dante Gabriel Rossetti line, partly because in the Hebrew, which is the word yesteryear, etmol ha'eshtakad, it appears as one word. And I thought that's so unusual because the only place I could see that in the English translations was in Rossetti's translation, where it kind of joins the words together like that. I was like, did you translate it from the French? Or did you find a Hebrew translation? Like, how did you go about it? And do you want to tell the story of where you
I first encountered Vaan in the film of The Petrified Forest. It's with Bette Davis and Humphrey Bogart. So I bought an anthology with a lot of dead English poets, and there was this line in his short biography, and it says, "Where the snow of yesteryear." So that's how I really like it. So I wrote a poem basically about the whole feeling, because it's talking about nostalgic places, and anyway, it fits what I wanted to say in the poem.
Yeah, so then of course, it was a fun moment for me when Vaan told me the source of the line, because when she sent me the screenshot of the page with English translation that had been her source, it was Rossetti's translation. So then it was like, oh, this is great. It's one of those, like you were saying, where you're sort of translating back to bringing it back home. But the whole story of how we get there is so like convoluted.
Yeah, because I look for a couple of books that I have that ציינו, how do we say it? ציינו, לציין. They noted that line, and you have it in מלכוד 99. What is the name of this? מלכוד 22. So you have it in all kind of
Catch 22.
Catch 22. I have it in like all sort of books in my library. So I just sent you photos of all that sources, and until we found out what I was basing my translation from.
Yeah, so basically now I feel like we have this mini essay of the transmission of this line in Hebrew literature, but none of these matched Nguyen Vaan's poem until it sort of figured out she was translating from the Rossetti. But this is the kind of work that just doesn't appear in the full printed translation. And so that's the other thing that I always find talking about translation is a chance to share with people some of this process and how it's sort of then, because it seems for someone reading the poem for the time, oh, this is rather straightforward. When translated from Rossetti, Adriana translate back to Rossetti, but it's not quite like it's
never
actually much longer. No,
yeah. Was it you, Adriana, or was it Marianne that recommended a book about translation? Remember?
Oh, This Little Art.
Yeah, it was you.
Yeah, that's a Kate Briggs book that came out a few years ago in English. And so Kate Briggs is a translator of, she's translated on Barthes from French into English. But this book, she writes about kind of the work translation. And actually, it's a very sort of feminist, I think, reading of the work of translation. Just kind of going through how like a lot of the discourse around translation is that translation is derivative, it's secondary, it's not true creative work. And so that this also explains why so many of the bad metaphors for translation tend to be feminine. So it's a wonderful book. I think kind of gets to some of the themes that we've all sort of been addressing, which that there's a lot happening behind the scenes of a translation, as there is when writing, right? We're all writers, and then you have this, like, at some point the word appears on a page and it feels very static. And which is why I like that Vaan is getting all this mail now. The Truffle Eye has come out, because it's really nice to see what, both in the fact that it's also an actual pen paper letters, and not just emails, also really fun.
Wow, yeah.
But that people read these poems and they have their own reaction to it. They read it in their own way, and then they feel compelled to put that to pen and paper and share it with Vaan. So it feels like then thing that can sometimes feel like it's too static and settled is actually really move around.
Yeah, that's the gift of it, right? That's the gift of translation, right? That it gets it to places that, beyond our reach. It's the hippie in me really loves that. You know what I mean? Like, it's such a, I often talk about, it's not so much about translation, but it's about literature and how, or fiction specifically maybe, but maybe even poetry. I just don't know because I'm not a poet. But, there's something about reading, how, especially like writing about Israel, say, which is an act also of a cultural translation, right? Putting it into English words, all those, subtleties of what it means to be Israeli, what it means to be Mizrahi, and Yemeni and all that stuff. And what people see on the news is very always flat, and then fiction gives voice to this one house, and one family and one voice, right? And it helps seeing the other as less other. And that's why when I read works, not just in translation, but from everywhere in the world, I feel like, that the world is both suddenly smaller, but also so much bigger. So yeah, I think translation allows that to happen, and it's when people talk about how reading can create empathy and how it can make us better people, that's where I go to in my mind. Yeah.
But I was also, I think in the process of translating Vaan's book, I think also struck by all these moments that to me, that they were like these translation moments in the poems, both because a lot of the poems are set in other places. So I'm picturing, well, this poem that in Paris, I imagine there's a lot of French and other languages, or the poems in New York, I'm imagining English, but also Spanish, Yiddish, and whatever, all the languages that sort of surround New York. I'm actually in Brooklyn right now, which is also a very multilingual borough. And so I'm nestled between all these different languages. And then of course, then I'm translating it into English and trying to keep some sort of sense of what I see as kind of this sort of multilingualism in the Hebrew. And I think reading The Art of Leaving felt very explicit to me, like when you include your father's Hebrew poetry in your translation, but that, there are all these ways that you're always gesturing. The whole book in a lot of ways is about translation, but also the translation that is happening when one is writing in a language,
in second language,
yeah. But also, it's also happening when you're writing in your language. I see it when Vaan is writing in Hebrew, which is Vaan, that primary language, but I can feel the influences of other languages, or like the sort of internal dialogue. So I know it's not so much of a question, it's more of an observation, but to what extent is that like saying, for like, so Vaan, when you're writing your poetry, like, do you have a sometimes that you're sort of translating something to Hebrew?
Not really. I'm just writing in Hebrew and thinking in Hebrew. But if I have some inspiration, like in the Vion sentence, then it's a translation from English, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Although he's French.
Right.
But
we're not hearing you, Vaan. You're muted.
That's the only language I know, so I can translate from others.
Yeah. Yeah. Are we around the time for? Yeah, we are.
I think we're ready for questions. I'm sure we could keep on talking about all sorts of stuff. We haven't even like touched on self-translation or other, but maybe we leave this to the audience. If anyone wants us to address them in particular. Yes, so send us questions.
You can also write in the chat in Hebrew if you want, and I will ask it in English. I actually have a question, so maybe I'll start. I thought now when Ayelet talked about the translation as a kind of empathy, I found it very interesting, and I thought about questions of identity regarding different languages and how it plays in literary works and translations. I will explain. So I feel when I speak different languages, I am a bit of a different person in every language, and but I feel it more in a direct way because language is communication, and I talk in a different language, so I communicate in a different way, and therefore I'm a bit different. Like my identity is a bit different, and I'm wondering if any of you have thoughts about different identities in literature regarding different languages. When you write in different languages.
As writers.
As writers, yeah. Also as translators, actually. Interesting, I think.
I'll jump in. I felt it more strongly when I started writing in English. I felt I was a different writer. I came into English. I moved to Canada when I was 25. By then I wrote in Hebrew. I was writing my whole life. I started writing when I was 5, you know, and I was like writing, you know, books and stories and poems. One of those weird children. So by the time I came to Canada, I felt like I had an identity as a writer. And then my identity was kind of ripped away from me because, you know, and I remember saying dramatically that I am like, you know, a craftswoman without her tools, tripped over tools, you know, like I suddenly was not a writer. I was not many things. I wasn't funny. I couldn't flirt. There was a lot of things that I suddenly couldn't do in my new language. But the writing thing was really hard on me. And it took me a few years before I went back to writing and into writing in English. Almost a decade of not writing at all because I was kind of in between languages. My Hebrew was starting to atrophy a little bit, which happens. It can happen to your tongue if you don't use it. And I wasn't using it. You know, it was also a time when there was no social media. There was. I was living entirely in English. I didn't know anyone who spoke Hebrew in Vancouver at the time. There were no Israelis in the city. But my English wasn't good enough. So I was kind of in between and I ended up not writing at all. And by the time I started writing in English, it was different. I was writing differently. And it goes back to the constraint too. You know, I literally did not have enough words, you know, to express myself. But also there was something about Canadianness, you know, there was something more restrained, you know, a little quieter, you know, and then I eventually found a way to be like, no, that's too restrained and too quiet, and that's not me. But then I was too loud for some Canadian audiences or my peers at the time. I was in an MFA workshop, but they said to me, like, it's too much. You know, it's just too much. It was too sentimental. It was too, you know, but, you know, screw that. You know, I found my own way eventually. But yes, it felt like I was a different writer. You know, in Hebrew, I was much more flowery. And it could be an age thing too. You know, I was a young writer and my vocabulary was great and I loved to flaunt it, you know, and I used all these like fancy words, and it was a little bit maybe too ornate. And in English, it was more spare. So it's a combination of things. It's a combination of age, of cultural influence, of constraint and limitation. But yeah, you know, and at first I missed a little bit the writer that I was, but I think ultimately, I think it made me a better writer at the end. Yeah.
Do you want to answer that, Vaan?
Well, people gain identity as they're living their life, like being a mother or a wife, and I don't have that identity. So my writing identity is very special and unique for me, and I do present myself as a writer, and but I also have my you know, my background like an Israeli Vietnamese writer and everything that people like to deal with. But yes, that's my shekels on identity and writing.
Yeah, I mean, I think growing up bilingual, I was always very aware of the different space. At home, English and Spanish sort of coexisted in this sort of messy, exhilarating way. And outside of home, there were just very clear spaces for each language. And that was always really interesting to me. And then hearing, you know, my mother speak English outside of the home, I always felt like she always carried herself a little differently. And then when I would go to Ecuador and visit the Ecuadorian side of the family and I was speaking Spanish, I always felt, oh gosh, this is like a slightly different Adriana. I don't want to sort of necessarily subscribe to the idea that we're different people in each language that we sort of at any moment are utilizing, just that it's the same person, but each language kind of offers up a different facet. So, and I think for me, Hebrew, like I said before, opened up the possibility of living with those other facets. And I'm just going to actually jump into Yefa's question about the relationship between translation and more traditional creative work. So for me, translating poetry is an incredibly creative practice. And it feeds directly into the poetry that I write and also to my academic writing. I feel like there's something about translating, whether it's translating Vaan or other poets, that it maybe goes back to that question of language and identity, that it's like you have, I feel like it's a for me to sometimes kind of role play a little bit. What's it like to actually be in someone else's language? And then try to sort of make it your own while still carrying over bits of it that kind of make it the other ones as well. It's a very sort of tricky negotiation, but I always feel like in that sense, translation is a chance to sometimes to get out of my own creative comfort zone, to metaphors that maybe I wouldn't necessarily conjure on my own, or to positions that I might find too strict in my own writing. But then once I've translated it, I've now a chance to test it out. And then oftentimes I can see like how it'll back and sort of and reshape my English writing, especially my creative writing. And so I find those things incredibly intertwined. about for you, like the relationship between, well, I guess translation, creative work, we've talked a bit about it, respect to your writing. Yeah. And with the gender question, well, I guess this is a Women in Translation event. So we talked a little bit earlier in an earlier conversation about that, and how I feel like over the years, a lot of my reading of poetry has been reading women poets, or women identified poets, and translating said poets. I think the exception is Khezi Leslie, who I've been trading on and off for many years. Other than that, most of the poets that I translate from Hebrew are women. And I do think that that is of a kind of very intentional sort of practice to engage intimately with women's writing and to give it a form and to acknowledge it. Especially because I grew with Hebrew, as a scholar of Hebrew literature, I know all too well how the field, both in terms of the scholarship and works that have been canonized, the voices of male writers have been hugely centered and privileged. And so I think for me, translating women poets is a way of redressing that a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say the same. I only happen to translate women poets, except for my father. When you said that, I was like, oh, wait a second, that's the poetry that I did translate into English. But it does feel, it does feel for me like an opportunity, yes, to give back a little bit, and I also try to translate Mizrahi women poets, not only, but I do try to put an emphasis on that, because, I see what is being translated from Hebrew into English, and I'd like to broaden that a bit. If I can, amplify a few more voices that have not been heard in North America, where mostly I get, if I publish those poems, that's where it would be, in Canada or in the US. That it feels like, like a mission. It's something, it's important. It's important to me. Yeah. Kind of use my privilege, I would say, in that way. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think one thing that I found so interesting as a literary translator is how a lot of times just how what you translate often then the ways kind of creates awareness in quote unquote source culture or source language. And I don't want to take sort of like some sort of major credit for that. I see it happening also when I read translations. I read actually quite a bit of translations of English language poetry. I'm always just so struck by how many poets I have encountered for the first time, English language poets I've encountered for the first in Hebrew translation. So it's like it's through Hebrew translations that suddenly these poets become visible to me. And I love that. I like to hope that somehow I'm also participating in that kind of economy. Like, I think one example is the poet Pat Parker, who I've read for the first time in Hebrew translation, and I completely fell in love with poems. And then it was actually really strange to read their work in English. I was like, because I was only here in the Hebrew translation.
Right?
So
I love
it. An amazing poet. The Hebrew translations are absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, it happened to me right now, actually. A poet that now I can remember her name, so it's useless to all of you, but I can say that Ruth Ben Yaakov translated her. And I read the poetry and I was like, oh, wow, this is wonderful. And I've never heard of her before. What was the name?
Kim Adonisio.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. So yeah, she just wrote it, Noga, as well.
Yeah. That's a new poet that I only heard about for the first time when I read some of the Hebrew translations. So it's like, it's wonderful. It's like, it opens up this world for me in English but yeah, Vaan, did you want to add anything? about kind of the way kind of other languages or your readings. You mentioned that you read a lot from English and how that feeds into your own creative work.
I'm trying to catch up with the American Vietnamese writer. I have a couple of anthology about the war, but it gives me like a whole idea about what the Vietnamese in American write about. And they usually write about the fathers and their father's memory and about the memory of a war. So this is what I do in these days, just catching up with the American scene, with the Viet American scene.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Truffle Eye come out, I think, in that sense, at a really interesting time, because there's a lot of attention being paid to not just Vietnamese American writing, I think like just the quote unquote Vietnamese literary diaspora and second generation writing in general. So I know that, yeah, Vaan's been approached by people to talk about that. And no, it's really fascinating.
That's awesome.
Just again, just afterlives of the translation can have. Wonderful. Anything else? We're getting close to
it's
the end of the event.
9.
Yes, it's late for the Israelis. I still have a long afternoon of me, but yeah, it's really wonderful to talk to you, Ayelet, and them as well. I hope that one day we can do this in person.
Me too. Thank you so much
for inviting me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nogas, and also Mila and Siput Pashut, my favorite bookstores in the world. Yes, and Grandma for supporting the event.
All right.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Good night, everyone.